Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you're joining us from. Thanks for attending today's webinar on managing risk and saving money by applying an asset management approach to a stormwater program. My name is Ryan Verdalen. I'm the marketing director for Stantec's North American Water Group. I'll be your moderator. A few housekeeping items, then we'll turn it over to Ed. First, you'll be muted during the presentation, but you can ask questions at any time using the GoToWebinar questions option. We will get to those at the end. Usually it's about 15 minutes left, so plenty of time for Q&A. Also, with about 5 minutes left, I will open up the mics and give you an ability to either follow up on your question or comment live if you would like to do so. And then finally, typically a week or two after the event, I'll follow up with everyone that attended and send you a webinar certificate of attendance that you can submit for potential PDH credits. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ed, and he'll lead the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you, Ryan. Appreciate that. And hi, everybody. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining me today, talking about managing risk and saving money in the way of applying asset management to a stormwater program. Kind of a relatively unique approach that one of our clients, the city of San Diego, has taken. Just real briefly about me, my name again is Ed Othmer. I'm Vice President. I'm the Stormwater and Wet Weather Flow Sector Leader for Stantec's North America practice. I also have been a stormwater practitioner for about 29 years, so stormwater runs in my blood. But I think most germane to this discussion today is I've had the opportunity to stand up the City of San Diego's Stormwater Asset Management Program back in 2013, a really cutting edge program back in the day, the first of its type ever. And then over the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to work again with the city to evolve the program, to incorporate some new ideas and innovations. And some of those I'm going to share with you today. So hopefully you'll learn a little bit from that experience. So here's today's agenda. First, I want to talk about some of the emerging business conditions that are actually driving the need for asset management. Then I'm going to talk about the approach that we took with the City of San Diego's program. And then I want to lean in a little bit on the financial model that we actually use to figure out what the city's funding needs are and what those funding strategies were going to look like into the future. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with some tidbits of innovations and lessons learned, and I think most importantly, some tips on how to get started with your program. And so that I don't distract you, I am going to turn my camera off and just leave it to the slides at this point. All right, so starting off with emerging business conditions, we see this just about every single day in the news. We have aging infrastructure all around us. Our infrastructure is dilapidated. This year, ASCE is actually going to be coming out with a report card that actually segregates stormwater infrastructure, and I'm not expecting an extremely high grade on that. But this is obviously a significant driver of any stormwater program. But there's many other things that we have to consider. For example, increasingly stringent regulatory requirements. We have total maximum daily loads, or TMDLs, that are coming to fruition. We often see that flood risk planning and water quality planning are disconnected from one another. Certainly here in the arid Southwest, where I'm located, we look at water resources in a holistic managed way. And so integrating water supply into that equation is also important. We're facing climate change and adaptation. Here's a shameless plug. Tomorrow, we're actually sponsoring a GWI conference, and you'll hear a little bit more about this later from Ryan. But you can understand how climate change is actually affecting us in the blue-green infrastructure that is tied to asset management programs more tomorrow. But I think also compelling is the clients, the customers, the citizens are really not always aware of the services that are being delivered because sometimes they're not clearly seen, or they're just completely unaware of them. And so this really creates an incredible challenge for stormwater managers across the country. So really, how do we deal with this situation? Well, it's relatively simple in the sense of you need to turn these types of conditions into action statements. We need to identify the best mix of increased efforts to comply with regulatory requirements. We need to develop long-term strategies to comply with those regulatory requirements, but also managing and replacing and planning for the rehabilitation of our aging infrastructure. We need to establish a framework that integrates flood risk management and water quality supply planning. And probably most importantly, we need to be able to package up all of these various elements, all of these various strategies into a single cohesive document so that we can make best use of the funding that is actually available to support the prioritize of a particular program. And we see that's exactly what Watershed Asset Management can do for you. So let's talk about the approach that we took with the city of San Diego to kind of run this to ground. I want to start off with some fundamental definitions of, what is asset management? And really, it's an approach. It's not necessarily a specific document, but it is an approach that allows one to clearly communicate what needs to be done and why it needs to be done. It will help you establish what your long-term funding needs are to sustain those levels of service that the citizens desire and the regulators require. But also importantly, for each and every one of the assets, you'll be able to identify what the risks are with those assets. What are the consequences of failure if you don't give that asset the love and attention it actually needs? Another element of asset management is it provides a sound basis for prioritizing work. I don't think there has been a single stormwater program across the country that I've come across that has been fully fleshed up with funding. And so stormwater managers are always having to be poised in a position where they're having to make difficult decisions on what they need to fund. And asset management can help you prioritize what that funding should be focused on. And then another key aspect of asset management is it is transparent and balanced. Once we've developed the algorithm of helping devise those management strategies and prioritization approach, we use that algorithm and machine to ultimately prioritize the work that needs to be done. And so we don't get distracted with those pet projects per se. We are focusing on those assets that deserve the most attention first because of their risk profile. So if that's not compelling enough, let's give you some examples of where asset management has been successful. Here's a couple. One example is Ross Valley Sanitation District. In this case, Ross Valley Sanitation District stood up their asset management program. And in doing so, they were able to defer or save $4 million of funding on spending that on unnecessary capital projects. It also allowed them to support a 40% increase in the rates with minimal opposition. That's quite incredible. Central Contra Costa Sanitary District is another great example. Once they stood up their asset management program, they were able to schedule preventive maintenance implementation, and that ultimately resulted in a reduction of SSOs by 70%. City of South Lake Tahoe is another great example. With the basis of an asset management plan in hand, they were able to go to their city council and get approval of their CIP program and get the funding that they needed to deliver. And then finally, but certainly not the last example, is the city of Folsom. Similar to Contra Costa, they were able to reduce their SSOs by 80%. But also extremely important here, they were able to gain a lot of trust with the Regional Water Quality Control Board and build credibility around their program. And that's almost something that you can't actually account for in terms of cost. So asset management is the practice of managing assets to minimize the total cost of delivering the service. And fundamentally, at its core, asset management establishes a process for prioritizing the work that needs to be addressed to address those highest assets first, those highest risk areas first. Now, today, most municipalities are still in the old way of doing business. Work is often planned based on the prior year's budget. They may go to city council and say, well, my budget was $20 million last year, and you know, I'm going to ask for another 20 million. Maybe they'll ask for 25 million, thinking I'm going to get cut back to 20 million anyway. But they often used the prior year's budget as the basis. Work activities are not always correlated with the priorities and risk of those particular assets. The other thing that is evident is the consequences of not meeting certain levels of service are not really made clear, not only to the staff, but also to the public. And then finally, the other example I'll bring up is, unfortunately, our elected officials often have short-term vision of 4 to 8 year cycles. And with an asset management approach, stormwater management staff now have a compelling document, a compelling reason to be able to plan for activities that are going to be 10 to 20 years out. So now the city of San Diego has actually been moving in quite a different direction over the last several years. They have a proactive work environment where budget requests are prioritized based on their need. They have a clear understanding of what their funding needs are to rehabilitate and replace their aging infrastructure. And probably more important, because it's a big part of their funding need, is they've been able to plan their projects to comply with TMDLs that are even 10 to 20 years out. And so ultimately, the goal that the city of San Diego has established is to address these issues before they ultimately become a failure. So one of the first steps that we took in standing up their program was meeting with their staff and their management to clearly understand what was the division's mission on delivering their program. It was really quite fundamental. It was to provide clean waterways and to make sure that they were providing flood-safe communities. And so once that mission was articulated, then we were able to work with them to establish 6 fundamental goals. And those goals are shown here on this dial. And those goals range from flood risk management to using stormwater as a resource to developing public partnerships to providing improved water quality. You can see here that we've organized their goals in this wheel. This was really important to the city because it really represented that no one particular goal was more important than another. Once we were able to do that, next thing we did was we took inventory of all of the individual discrete programs that they had in hand, whether it was complying with their NPDES permit, whether it was their desire to find another water resource and using stormwater as that resource, whether it was their research program to advance their thinking of the NPDES field, whether it was their condition assessment program of their corrugated metal pipe, you name it. We took inventory of all these discrete programs. We funneled them into a single approach, that's asset management. And the way we did, and the reason why we did this was because it was the most effective way to blend these programs to understand really what those true priorities are that needed to be a focus for the city. So once we were able to take inventory of all of these various programs and plans, the next thing we did was really stand up the fundamental document. And to do so, we needed to answer 5 fundamental questions. The first question is, what do we own and manage? What are those assets that are important that the city has to manage? What if each of those assets require levels of service that need to be delivered? What's the condition of those assets? Which of those assets are actually critical? Which assets are not so critical? And then ultimately, what are my optimized management strategies to address those assets? How much is it going to cost me to manage those assets? When will those assets need to be maintained, repaired, rehabilitated, and what's associated cost? And then once we were able to get through those 4 steps, then we had a clear sense of an asset register. We had a clear sense of what it was going to take to deliver the city of San Diego's program, and we could put dollars and cents to the whole thing, and ultimately define what it was going to take to fund that program. And I'll give you some examples of that in a few later slides. So this next slide really presents one of the key innovations to the City of San Diego's asset management program that is really unique and different than just about any other program I've run across in North America. Most programs, asset management programs, whether it's for a water utility or wastewater utility in North America, they certainly focus on physical assets. Those are those types of assets that you can actually touch and feel. They're the pipes, they're the structural BMPs, They're the drain inlets. They're the physical monitoring equipment that you're using in the field. They're easy to get your hands around because you can actually see them. But the other important part of their program we call them programmatic assets. These are human-created, intangible, experiential elements or assets or elements of their program that still need to be managed. Great example is if you've got an NPDES program, you know that you have 6 fundamental minimum control measures that you have to implement. And those are things like your education and outreach program, your monitoring program, your illicit discharge detection program. All of those programs are very difficult to touch and feel, but you still have to invest in those programs to actually implement them to comply with the regulatory requirements, which is the specific level of service that the regulators are requiring. So why include them? As I just said, they're providing a level of service, whether it's tied to flood risk management in the city's case or water quality. It's extremely important that we capture them. But they also account for a significant proportion of the City of San Diego's stormwater program cost. So let me give you a few examples here of different types of assets and through a collage of photographs. Here's a series of physical assets that are existing today across North America. One that Stantec is extremely proud of is the New Orleans Permanent Canal Closure and Pump Station project that's in the top left corner. This project was constructed as a result of Hurricane Katrina, an absolutely incredible project, and so incredible in fact that it was actually shown on the History Channel's Project Impossible, so check that out. But assets can also be other types. There is the biofiltration strip and infiltration trench at the bottom of the screen that is located at Caltrans maintenance yard. It's drain inlet protection, or it could be corrugated metal pipes such as shown here in this picture on the bottom right, but I wouldn't necessarily classify that as an asset. I would call that more as a liability. I also talked about physical assets from a future sense. And this, again, is another unique and innovative aspect of the City of San Diego's program. Not only was the city concerned about their current asset inventory of what's in the ground today or what they're managing today, but they're also looking out into the future. Some excellent examples I can give you include all of the different plans to revitalize the Los Angeles River. There's tremendous amounts of exercises and activities that want to green up the river as well as improve the health of the river. And so those should be classified in an asset management plan. In the Los Angeles region, another great example is with the passage of the Safe Clean Water Program, Measure W in 2018, there's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of multi-benefit stormwater harvesting projects that are going to serve the communities. And each and every one of these projects should be captured in an asset management program for the future funding needs that are needed. And then the last but not least that I'll leave you with is the bottom left. And this is the City of Long Beach Must Urban Stormwater Treatment Project. This project is an absolutely incredible project that I've had the pleasure to manage over the last several years. It's the first of its type to capture urban runoff from 15 pump stations along the LA River, treat that water and turn it into a resource. This project's about to be advertised for construction, but it still will show up in an asset register as a future asset because it is yet to be built. Let's touch on programmatic assets one more time to try to hammer this message home a little bit. Again, these are sort of those intangible assets, but they still require energy and effort to manage, whether it's a monitoring program, as you can see here on the left, to public education and outreach campaign programs, such as the Scoop the Poop program up in San Mateo County, to even investments that are needed to negotiate NPDES permits and to update local ordinances. All of those activities take lots of effort and really should be managed as discrete assets. And that's exactly what the City of San Diego has done. So if we take a look at the City of San Diego, here's sort of a collage or a summary of all of their assets. They have over 90,000 assets in total over almost 5.7 to $6 billion worth of asset replacement costs in their inventory. But the other message I want to communicate in this particular slide is, even though the city of San Diego is the 8th largest city in the nation and has a tremendous amount of stormwater assets alone, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't apply an asset management program to a smaller program. In fact, it should be applied to just about every program, whether it's size of the city of New York, the largest city in the nation, all the way down to the smallest utility. So once we were able to take inventory of all these assets, we needed to find a structured way to manage each of those assets. And we organized them in what's called a hierarchy. So we looked at the physical assets and we figured out how those assets needed to be managed. We took a pump station and we broke those apart into sub-elements. We looked at impellers, we looked at the motors themselves, the SCADA system. Each of those discrete elements were sub-assets to the overall physical asset of a pump station. We even went down to a storm drain system and looked at each segment, and every one of those was managed down at the segment level or the drain inlet level. And then finally, on the programmatic asset approach, these could be managed at a higher level within the city because much of these assets are implemented across its entire jurisdiction. And so it was important to manage assets this way because it allowed the city to most efficiently and cost effectively deliver the service that each of these assets were responsible for providing. All right, I want to shift gears just a little bit here and talk about probably the most important aspect of asset management, and that is defining the criticality of each and every one of the assets. And the process that we applied is called business risk exposure analysis. Very, very simple process. It's looking at every asset's probability of failure, and that probability of failure is directly related to its condition or reliability or performance. And we multiplied that condition based on the consequence of failure. So if that asset were to fail, what was the consequence of that failing? And when we looked at consequence of failure, probably the most important thing we did here was we didn't just look at the monetary failure of its consequence. We looked at this holistically from a triple bottom line approach. And this, again, was another unique and innovative approach that we took to the city, which helped them make stronger decisions on which assets they needed to focus their attention on. So let's talk about probability of failure. This can be organized into really 4 fundamental failure modes, whether it's capacity. So a pipe has a certain capacity, for example, and if the pipe doesn't have the requisite capacity to manage a certain design storm, then it's not meeting its capacity, and it's ultimately defined as being failed. Level of service is another failure mode. If we have intention to implement a public education campaign program, but we don't have the funding to do that, it's possible that we could get fines and penalties through a regulator because of the lack of implementing that particular program. Mortality is another fundamental way of a failing asset. And you saw that in one of the earlier pictures with that corrugated metal pipe. This is a condition in which the asset has reached its useful life and needs to be replaced, and certainly, if not, rehabilitated. And then last but not least is efficiency. And it's making sure that the asset that is chosen is the right asset to deliver the level of service that's most important. Probably the best example I could give you is if you have a situation in your watershed, and let's take trash as an example as being the problem, pollutant of concern in a watershed. You can simply institute trash interceptor devices like CDS units to address that problem versus having to build a $500,000 to $1 million Austin sand filter to serve the same purpose. So that gets back to efficiency. So let's talk about how assets fail. And I'm going to look at this from 2 different types of asset conditions. First and foremost, assets will fail over time. And it's going to be based on their condition. And what's shown here on the graph is there's really the desired condition of what that asset should be placed in. And that's really its original condition when it was installed or first implemented. And then ultimately that asset condition is going to decay over time and reach a minimum standard that is acceptable. But once it crosses that red line, that asset is going to be in a condition where it's not providing the service that it needs to and deemed to be in a failed mode. And that graph right there, that curved line is a good example of a constructed asset, such as a pipe in the ground. But if we look at programmatic assets or perhaps some other natural type of assets like receiving water, so the city has actually classified receiving waters as assets, we can see that the condition of a receiving water may not be where it needs to be. It may not be meeting its desired water quality standard and delivering the beneficial uses that the citizens desire and regulators require. So ultimately, investments need to be made within the watershed to improve the health of that receiving water. So ultimately, the water quality standards are being met and those beneficial uses are being achieved. Important aspect of this is the level of service and defining what that is. And that really starts off with the customer's expectations. And much like all of us set the bar pretty high in terms of establishing a level of service. But that comes in with some form of a balance. So to achieve a higher level of service, that's going to come with a resulting cost to deliver that level of service. And if we don't necessarily invest effectively, then the risk is also going to increase. So there's a balance here that needs to be struck. And this is the point in which really is a discussion and a negotiation, I would say, with the citizens and the regulators that are demanding a specific level of service. So bringing all this together, I wanted to give you some examples of probability of failure and how we've made use of this. So for each and every one of the City of San Diego's assets, we looked at probability of failure. Every asset will have at least one failure mode. It may be mortality, such as the condition of this pipe. It may be capacity, such as an overflow situation here. It could be a level of service that's not being achieved. Maybe there's some multi-benefit project that really needs to be instituted to enhance that local community. Or it could be efficiency. Maybe it's rerouting street sweeper program to be more efficient because there's more pollutants in certain parts of the watershed or in certain streets. Every single asset will have at least one of these failure modes, and in some cases, more than one failure mode. So we applied a score for, let me go back to that screen, of a probability of failure for each and every one of these assets. And that score ranged from 1 to 5, 1 meaning that that asset was actually in pretty good shape. It was relatively new and didn't need, it wasn't subject to failure anytime soon. Whereas at the other end of the extreme is probability of failure score of 5, meaning that asset has already failed or is about to fail or failure is imminent and really needs to be, needs to have some attention. So in regards to consequence of failure, I mentioned this earlier and I wanted to bring this home, is we applied a triple bottom line approach to defining consequence of failure for each and every asset. So looking at its economic and environmental and social consequence. We did this because we feel that it's a transparent and balanced approach of looking at consequences. And also importantly here, it doesn't borrow from future generations. So we're not just focusing on the economics of an asset, we're looking at the long-term sustainability of the overall health of the stormwater program. So let's talk about consequence in terms of specifically what we look at. So in, some examples include the social aspect, the consequence of failure. In this regard, the City of San Diego carefully looked at the location of asset relative to disadvantaged communities. And if an asset was located in a disadvantaged community, the consequences of failure was particularly high. And we wanted to make sure that we were giving more weight towards that asset over an asset that was not located in a disadvantaged community. We wanted to look at the position of that asset relative to the environment. was that asset related to a watershed that was tied to a TMDL impaired water body? If it was, it got a higher score. If it was not, it got a lesser score. And then, of course, excuse me, we looked at the economics of the asset. So if the asset was going to fail, what was the consequences of that failure from a funding perspective? Was it relatively small amount of funding that the department could relatively easily absorb with their existing funding stream? Or was it going to be catastrophic and going to have to go back to council to seek some additional emergency funding to address that failed asset? So all of these were applied to each and every one of the city of San Diego's stormwater assets. Once we were able to collect this information, we were able to multiply those factors together, POF and COF, and plot them up on a matrix. And so we could figure out which of those assets were most important that the city should be focusing on. So those assets that were ranked in the high risk zone, those were areas that the city should be focused on. Whereas if the assets were identified in the low risk zone because they had a low probability of failure and a low consequence of failure, our approach to the city, because their funding was limited, was they needed to start to shift some of the funding from the low risk zone towards the high risk zone to address those assets. So let's take a real case example to kind of ring this home, to really show you the importance of providing a risk-based approach to a stormwater program. Here's an example that took place within the city of San Diego, very commonplace throughout the United States. You have a 48-inch corrugated metal pipe that filled in the middle of the street. On the surface, it presented a 11-foot by 10-foot surface opening, big enough to swallow a car for sure. But much like an iceberg, the problem was much bigger below the surface. In this case, the cavity that it created was a 50-foot by 20-foot by 18-foot hole in the ground, big enough to swallow several tractor trailers. So that's the issue. It failed. One of the consequences was city had to close the westbound lanes and eastbound lane turn pocket of this particular area. And that created a tremendous amount of traffic problems. There's a local school nearby. And so the parents had a difficult time driving to the school to retrieve their kids. And you can imagine the outcry from the parents on the news when this asset failed adjacent to the school. They were extremely concerned for the children's health and safety. To really add insult to injury, unfortunately, this 10-year-old golden retriever actually fell into that hole as well. At the end of the day, the golden retriever was retrieved by the fire department and was saved and recovered from falling into the hole. But again, not a tremendously great situation. And then if we actually just look at the financial consequences of what took place, if the city had implemented a proactive replacement program originally, the replacement of that pipe would have been about $40,000. But this catastrophic failure cost the city $1.3 million. So to me, this is a tremendous example to encourage you to develop a asset management program. You can save the cost of developing an asset management program, or you can save the cost of one catastrophe like this with the development of your asset management program for sure. So I wanted to talk about how this really all fit together in a single puzzle. It's actually pretty straightforward. Again, we took all of the plans and programs that the city had. We dissected them to define what those assets were. Those assets and their attributes were funded into an enterprise asset management system. In the case of the city of San Diego, we've developed with our partners a standalone database to manage that asset inventory, and ultimately with the long-term plans to integrate that into the city's SAP system. And that system really has a lot of functionality. It's intended to promote instructions to the public work staff so that they understand what they need to work on a given day, but also there's that feedback loop of tracking what has been accomplished back into enterprise asset management system. And then management use that system to report out on what's been accomplished, what still needs to be accomplished, so that ultimately they can plan for their future funding needs. And then on a once-a-year basis, the city exports the information from that system and they process it, they optimize and they analyze that data to figure out what additional work needs to be accomplished or what additional enhancements need to be done. So I want to shift gears now to future investment needs that the city discovered. And really, when we start talking about a stormwater management program, or just about any utility for that matter, there's really two individuals that play into this equation. One is the operations manager, and the operations manager is obviously concerned about what is it going to cost for me to deliver this program. And then the second person that's involved is the finance manager. And this person's concerned about, well, how am I actually going to pay for this program? Excuse me. And so one of the first things that we did was we were able to develop a cost of service through standing up this asset management program. And you can see here, this is the City of San Diego's cost profile over the next 4 years. This basically talks about how much funding the City of San Diego needs to deliver the services and manage all of their assets over the next 4 years. These assets organized around those assets tied to water quality, as well as those assets that are tied to flood risk management. You can see there in the bar charts with each of the different colors. But also important, we were able to overlay where those investments were going to take place in the various parts of the City of San Diego's 6 different watersheds, which was important. So all total, it is an incredible cost for the City of San Diego to deliver their program to the tune of about $270 million a year to fully deliver their stormwater program. So the other thing we're able to do is relate the cost of their program to delivering and meeting each and every one of their 6 goals that I had talked about before. And you can see that in the graphic on the right side of the screen. So the City of San Diego over the next 40 years is going to have to invest approximately $2.8 billion to improve water quality coming from their MS4. Whereas they're going to spend about $17 million developing those relationships with the public. So big investments that the city has to make in order to ultimately achieve these goals. But ultimately, this database that was stood up was able to provide the analytics necessary to provide this information in a simple way. So one of the things that I did want to talk about is really the evolution of the city's financial program. When we stood up this program back in 2013, really it was nothing more of summarizing the funding needs of the stormwater program. And the city has made incredible strides over the last 2 years of figuring out and reviving what the cost of service is to deliver. But they've taken it to the next level to really start to look at a funding strategy. And really, this has been a critical failure by most government sector managers, is to develop an optimized financial plan and funding strategies to deliver a sustainable and affordable program and compare those program costs against alternative levels of service. But this is really a differentiation of where Stantec has come to play, where we've developed an interactive financial model. We call it Financial Analysis and Management System, FAMS, which evaluates and compares the financial feasibility of alternative funding strategies and cost recovery mechanisms side by side in a real-time situation. And the results of this development is a holistic multi-year financial management plan that results in a sustainable and affordable mechanism which can be integrated into an asset management program. So I'm sure Ryan and Tony Fink, my collaborators with this presentation, will be more than happy to share you a link to this FAMS product that we're very proud of. So I'm coming to the end of the presentation, and I wanted to leave you with some discussion on some of the innovations, the lessons learned, and really how to get started. Starting off with innovations, and again, this is a rehash of what I've said earlier. First and foremost, we brought in the city's programmatic assets into the fold of this program. They're a necessity to effectively manage and deliver their program, and they have an incredible cost to deliver, and so it made perfect sense to bring them in. Secondly, you saw how we were able to map the line of sight of investment costs to achieving the city's goals, as well as through other comparison of KPIs. And so it's a great way to be able to present to the local community and stakeholders the investments that you're asking them to make, and ultimately what they're going to get out of those particular investments. Also importantly is this holistic approach. We didn't just focus on water quality assets. We looked at programmatic assets from a flood risk management perspective, as well as looking at assets from a water supply perspective. Brought all those together under one single roof, which quite honestly is necessary if you have a vision of taking advantage of an integrated planning framework approach. Asset management is the tool that can help you get there. And then last but not least, this is extremely important. We were able to look well beyond the city's existing asset inventory and focus on future assets. Lessons learned, we certainly learned that there is a culture shift, and I'm sorry, I just got a red notification. There's been a culture shift that needs to take place to go from the old way of business to the new way, and that often requires some organizational changes. So I want to, caution you about that it is a paradigm shift that your organization would have to go through. And then the other thing that we've learned is you really have to memorialize the business processes to manage each and every one of your assets. And then finally, I wanted to leave you with how to get started. And you don't have to have a comprehensive inventory of everything that you own and manage. Start off with the simplest spreadsheet to get started. Make sure that you're not using asset management as some remote tool, that it is really kind of core to your asset management approach or your stormwater management approach. You need to make sure that stormwater management is bought into this approach so that they can help drive the success of the implementation of the program. But it's also extremely important that staff be engaged, because they're often the folks that have the information to support the program. I'll also say that software doesn't have to be complex. There's many different software packages out there that can be tailored to fit your specific need. But most importantly, just get started, because ultimately I know that you'll be able to manage this program once it's stood up. So with that, I would like to leave it some time for questions, if you don't mind. And so I'm going to ask Ryan and Tony to jump back on and help facilitate some of those questions. Thank you.
You got it, Ed. Thank you very much. We have a number of good questions here, so let's go ahead and get started. First one, how do you deal with geographical and stormwater variability, such as intensity, duration, et cetera, differences in a stormwater asset management program?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I think of that question, really there's two conditions that come to mind. One is all of those elements drive towards the capacity of the existing infrastructure. And so capacity is one of those failure modes. And as climate changes, obviously the capacity of that infrastructure and the needs of that infrastructure is going to change. And so you really should start focusing on looking at doing an assessment, a hydrologic and hydraulic assessment of the capacity of your existing infrastructure, looking at those critical areas where you're likely to cause more impactful flooding, and to focus on those watersheds as a priority. The same could be said for water quality. As you've seen in some of the earlier slides, we've organized a priority of assets based on the condition of the associated watershed that those assets reside in. If an asset resides in a TMDL watershed, it's going to get more of a priority than an asset that resides in a watershed that we're seeing that there's really no impact to receiving water quality.
All right, great. And just to FYI, you've got an Outlook notice up on your screen, if you could kill that. All right, next question. When you were developing the COF and ROF, did you factor in climate change to say, even though it may not meet level of service now, maybe it won't in the future? Sorry, even though it might meet level of service now, maybe it won't in the future based on climate change scenarios.
I'm sorry, Ryan, could you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, sure. I kind of botched it there. Sorry, Simon, who asked the question. When you were developing the COF and ROF, did you factor in climate change to say, even though it may meet level of service now, maybe it won't in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. For the city of San Diego, quite honestly, most of their infrastructure is not meeting the current level of service in regards to flood risk management. So the city has a current storm drain design manual that they're following, and we use that as the basis for establishing level of service. But what I will say is this, is that the city of San Diego is participating with Stantec on a new water research foundation study where we are evaluating the impacts of climate change on flood risk management. And through that exercise, I would expect that the city is going to be able to gain information to look at that infrastructure, maybe potentially even modify their storm drain design manual to identify what those conditions are that are changing as a result of climate change, and perhaps modify their probability of failure criteria based on that new information.
Okay, great. All right, another question. I understand the Stormwater Asset Management Plan is tied to the Roads and Highways AMP as well. So the cost shown in the presentation included the costs of both AMP, or is it only for the Stormwater AMP?
The costs are tied. Let me back up a little bit. So what we did was, for every stormwater asset, we have defined a specific replacement cost. When it came to defining the future assets that were needed in the watershed, say to comply with TMDLs, we defined those as specific projects, and those specific projects were comprised of many different assets, and it was whether they were stormwater related or whether they were, road related or other community enhancement related assets. They were all kind of bundled together as a single project, and we defined that as a single future asset that needed to be funded. Ultimately, once that project gets built, the associated individual assets will be identified and defined as individual discrete assets that would have its own maintenance and rehabilitation and replacement period.
Okay, great. When the business risk exposure criteria was developed, did you have to calibrate it or tweak it to make sure it worked correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. We had gone through probably a half a dozen iterations with City of San Diego staff to properly calibrate it. We started off by conducting a workshop with the City of San Diego staff, a very series of workshops, quite honestly, to establish what we thought, what they thought the probability of failure and consequence of failure criteria were to begin with. And straight out of the gate, we worked with them to develop some initial criteria. We took that information back into the BRE model, and then we ran those results. And then what we did was we took a handful of assets and we used that to sort of calibrate where we stood in terms of the overall BRE score and what would have been expected. And in some cases, we were underestimating the BRE score for certain assets, such as their corrugated metal pipe. And as a result of that, we work with city staff to come up with other criteria and thresholds that we're going to further prioritize or make those assets a bit higher in the ranking. So it was an evolution process, and it did take a little bit of iteration, but at this point, we feel as though we've got a pretty good handle on that. In fact, when we look at the risk profile, it's more of a bell-shaped curve that we would expect, where there's a fair amount of few low-risk assets. Most of the assets are sort of in this moderate risk range, and then we have other smaller batch of assets in a higher risk range.
Right, good. Another question: how prevalent is the use of artificial intelligence in utilities asset management? Good question there, tough one.
That's a tough one. I mean, I am not the artificial intelligence guy. I can tell you, for the City of San Diego program, we're just not there yet. That's a question I honestly am going to have to get back to you with, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that, or put you in touch with the right person at Stantec, because we have an entire initiative focused on artificial intelligence tied to condition assessment of programs. So I apologize for not being able to give you a full answer, but we will get you the right person.
Yeah, that's fair, Ed. Such a shift in the business model should be carried out in phases, is a comment with a question of how would you set reasonable intermediate goals that can be achieved?
Yeah, that's a great question, and what you have to do is start with baby steps. And the first thing we started with the City of San Diego was really developing that asset register to have it organized around nomenclature, for example, that they were accustomed with, and that they were used to communicating, using their vernacular per se. That was one of the initial steps. The bigger step, in which we're taking baby steps towards, is how do you effectively implement this program? And ultimately, there's a need to reorganize the organization so that they can be more efficient and effective of how these programs are ultimately delivered. That takes baby steps, and that also takes change management. So it's not just a matter of launching an asset management program and fully implementing it straight out of the gate, but change management has to be part of the equation when setting up any structural changes to an organization to go from an old way of business to more of a proactive way of business, looking at a risk profile instead of a traditional way of managing your program.
All right. What's your advice to utilities that have a combined sewer system and are trying to implement and manage stormwater asset management?
Well, it would be exactly the same as what I've expressed before. The only difference is I touched on integrated planning framework, and with IPF, basically it's a mechanism now that allows utilities that have to comply with anything under the roof of the Clean Water Act to integrate their program in a holistic way. And in regards to a CSO program, obviously we're dealing with wastewater and stormwater as a combined system. And what you should be doing is looking discreetly at each of these programs, but ultimately bringing them in together and prioritizing where those investments are going to have the biggest bang for the dollar, where you're going to get the most improvements first. So my advice is, again, follow that 10-step process, but be holistic about how you do that. Take inventory of all of the assets that are necessary to deliver your wastewater program as well as your stormwater program, and bring those together, and then ultimately you'll be able to develop a risk profile based on that combination of asset inventory.
All right, good. Still coming in here, lots of good questions. Can the same principles be applied to a wastewater facility scenarios? It says.
Absolutely. This whole principle can be applied. So for the City of San Diego, they've applied it to their stormwater program. And as I talked about before, most asset management programs focused around stormwater programs are really organized around physical assets, those hard assets in the ground. The city took the next step and focused around some of the nebulous assets as well, those programmatic assets. And so they're holistically looking at their program. Now, if the utility wanted to just break up their program in terms of collection systems versus their treatment plant, you can certainly organize a program that way as well. Ultimately, I would say it makes perfect sense to bring both of those programs under one roof, but as I presented in some of the earlier slides, you can set up a hierarchy so that you can understand how to manage each of those class of assets, whether it's under the treatment plant, within the fence line, or in a collection system.
Good. All right, we've got a few minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and open up the mics. So if anyone on the phone would like to mute themselves and comment or ask a question directly of Ed, you may do so now. And while we wait on that, I'll ask one more question that's sitting in the box here. And that would be specific to, let's see, where'd that one go? This is a FAMS question. So can FAMS, you mentioned FAMS earlier, can that assist a stormwater utility in developing a multi-year CIP based on the condition of the assets?
Absolutely, 100%. And that is the biggest advantage that the city of San Diego took with the implementation of FAMS over the last year and a half or so. We have taken the use of FAMS to do exactly that. The asset management approach allowed us to develop the cost of service for that program, but we used FAMS to figure out what that funding need was over a projected series of years, but also help develop that funding strategy, and then also tie that to manipulating different levels of service. So absolutely, and that's been done elsewhere in the country. And if you want more information on FAM, certainly let myself or Ryan know, and we will put you in touch with the right people within Stantec.
Okay, good. All right, if anybody wants to ask a question or comment, you're welcome to do so on live now. I'll pause for a moment to give you a chance here. All right, everybody's going to be shy. That's fine. I'll grab another question then. What's the greatest challenges? What is one of the greatest challenges you see with the implementation of an asset management program? I think you covered pretty well at the end, but maybe you're one of the ones.
Yeah, I really think the greatest challenge is it's not really standing up the program itself. It's moving this. It's that paradigm shift of having staff get out of the old way of doing business and not just having staff focused on, say, their monitoring program or their education program, but realizing that with limited funding, that investments need to be focused around those highest priority assets. And that requires a bit of a cultural change to have staff recognize that. But I want to give the city of San Diego a commendation on this. They have tremendous leadership that has been able to not only stand up this asset management program from a technical perspective, but they've actually moved in that direction of true implementation and have done that through a lot of great cultural change because the leadership actually buy into it. And because the leadership has bought into it, they have a lot of great staff that have now bought into it and realize that they're part of a bigger program and they're not just necessarily focused on one aspect of the success of the city of San Diego's program.
Good. All right. Well, good. One final question here. Let's end on a good one here. For each asset that will be replaced, would you apply the same holistic triple bottom line approach to compare different design alternatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So by the way, when we have so we've come up with specific criteria that we think apply to all of the city of San Diego's assets. That doesn't necessarily mean we've captured all of the criteria that could be a TBL benefit cost analysis that need to be considered. But these were the ones that sort of rose to the surface for the city of San Diego. We've been involved with several other projects around the country, including the Blue-Green Infrastructure Project in New Orleans, where we've applied a triple bottom line approach. where we look at a whole host of different social and environmental factors and come up with the monetary evaluation of those factors. And so I would say each city would need to look at this through their particular lens. I guess I'm going to leave it with this. Here's another shameless plug. I invite you all to attend the GWI session tomorrow, where we're going to talk more about the blue-green infrastructure around the country. And in particular, we'll be able to get into TBL, benefit cost analysis, in New Orleans. And Ryan, the last thing I'd like to say is thank the city of San Diego for their willingness and their leadership in driving asset management and a stormwater program. They've really done a tremendous job, and it's really helped position them to seek the funding that they need into the future. So I wanted to thank that leadership team in particular.
Yeah, agreed. And with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks again to everyone that joined. Feel free to reach out to Ed, whose contact information was on the screen and also in the chat directly if you'd like some more information. And thanks for attending, and we hope to see you on an upcoming webinar.
Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy your day. Be safe.